When Frank Mitchell plunged into the icy waters of Silver Creek to rescue a child being swept away by the current, he never imagined he was saving the daughter of Dr. James Harrington, one of the country's most renowned neurosurgeons. With his beloved wife, Sarah, fighting a losing battle against a rare brain condition, and their family ranch drowning in medical debt, Frank returned home one evening to find an unfamiliar car in his driveway and discovered that the grateful father had tracked him down with an offer that would transform their desperate situation forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Mitchell's weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he repaired the aging irrigation pump that serviced the eastern fields of Willow Creek Ranch. At 45, Frank's face carried the permanent tan and fine creases of a man who'd spent his life under open skies, his strong frame shaped by decades of physical labor rather than any deliberate fitness regimen. The early June sun beat down on his shoulders as he worked, but Frank barely noticed the heat. A lifetime in western Montana had acclimated him to the region's dramatic seasonal shifts. "Just hold together a little longer," he muttered to the stubborn pump that supplied water to his struggling alfalfa fields. "That's all I'm asking." From the nearby farmhouse, his Australian shepherd Max barked twice before racing across the sun-baked ground toward the gravel driveway where a familiar pickup truck approached, the distinctive rumble of its engine announcing Frank's younger brother Daniel before he came into view. Frank straightened, wincing slightly as his back protested. 15 years of maintaining the ranch without updating equipment had taken its toll, though he'd never admit that to anyone, least of all Daniel, who'd left ranch life for a construction business in Riverdale, the nearest town 30 miles away. "Should have known I'd find you fixing something," Daniel called as he climbed from his truck. At 40, Daniel carried the Mitchell family features, the same deep-set blue eyes and strong jawline, but his hands lacked the calluses of ranch work. His shoulders unburdened by the weight of preserving a struggling family legacy. "Equipment doesn't fix itself," Frank replied with a half-smile. Despite occasional envy for his brother's more predictable livelihood, there was no real resentment between them. Daniel had offered numerous times to help financially, but Frank's pride had always prevented him from accepting. The brothers walked toward the two-story farmhouse that had been in the Mitchell family for nearly 90 years. Its blue paint was fading, and the front porch sagged slightly on the western corner, but to Frank it was still the most beautiful building in Clearwater County. "Coffee's still hot," Frank said as they entered the warm kitchen. The house was modest but meticulously maintained inside, with the original hardwood floors his grandfather had installed and the sturdy oak table around which 3 generations of Mitchells had shared meals. Daniel settled at the table while Frank poured 2 mugs of coffee. On the kitchen wall hung family photographs spanning decades. Frank and Daniel as children helping their father mend fences, their mother standing proudly beside her prize-winning horses, their grandparents posing with the first tractor the family had ever owned. Most prominently displayed was a faded photograph of Frank's grandfather, William Mitchell, standing in front of the newly built farmhouse in 1935. "How's Sarah?" Daniel asked, his voice softening as he mentioned Frank's wife. Frank's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Good days and bad days. Today's been better. She's resting now." He set the mugs down, avoiding his brother's gaze. The truth that Sarah's good days were becoming increasingly rare hung unspoken between them. "And Melissa?" Daniel asked, referring to Frank and Sarah's 19-year-old daughter. "Finals week at State. She'll be home this weekend." Pride briefly lightened Frank's expression. Melissa was the first Mitchell to attend college, studying agricultural science with plans to modernize the family ranch, if there was still a ranch by the time she graduated. "She still doesn't know how bad things are?" Daniel asked carefully. Frank shook his head. Sarah and I agreed, not until after finals. She needs to focus. Daniel wrapped his hands around the warm mug, his expression growing serious. And the specialists in Denver. Any news? Frank stared into his coffee. The treatment program is promising, but he trailed off, the unspoken reality of their financial situation hanging in the air between them. Sarah had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition 2 years earlier. The local doctors had done their best, but Sarah's symptoms increasing. Mobility issues, debilitating headaches, and occasional cognitive lapses had steadily worsened. A specialist in Denver had proposed an innovative treatment protocol that showed promise, but their insurance wouldn't cover the experimental procedure, and the out-of-pocket costs were staggering. You didn't drive all this way to ask about Sarah, Frank said finally, recognizing the cautious expression that had settled on his brother's face. Daniel sighed. Mark Sinclair from First National Bank was at the job site yesterday. There's talk about your loan. Frank's jaw tightened. He'd hoped to have more time before word spread. Riverdale was small, just over 5,000 people, and news traveled fast, especially bad news about one of the county's oldest ranching families. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My business with the bank is private, Frank said more sharply than he'd intended. Not in Riverdale, Daniel countered. Frank, if you're in trouble again, I'm handling it. Frank stood and moved to the window overlooking his fields. The alfalfa he'd planted in April stood in neat rows, promising a good yield if the weather held and the irrigation system didn't fail completely. The high-protein variety, which commanded premium prices from organic dairy farms, represented his best hope of balancing the ranch's precarious finances while still covering Sarah's ongoing medical expenses. The truth Frank couldn't bring himself to share was that Willow Creek Ranch was 3 months behind on its mortgage. The bank had granted him extensions based on the projected yield of his summer crop, but their patience was wearing thin. The most recent statement from the hospital sat unopened on his desk, alongside brochures about the treatment program in Denver that remained financially out of reach. You know, Daniel said carefully, the offer still stands. Janice and I have that money from selling the Riverside property. We could— No, Frank cut him off firmly. I told you before, I'm not taking your savings. This ranch has been in our family for 3 generations. It's my responsibility now. Daniel ran a hand through his hair in frustration, a gesture so like their father that Frank had to look away. It's not just your responsibility, Frank. It's your life, all of it. When's the last time you took a day off? The ranch was never meant to be a prison. Frank remained silent. How could he explain to Daniel that the ranch wasn't a prison but his purpose? That despite the hardships, the equipment breakdowns, the rising costs, the unpredictable weather, he still felt the same connection to this land that had sustained their family through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless personal tragedies. The Mitchells don't quit. That's what their grandmother had said countless times during Frank's childhood. Her words had carried him through the dark days after Sarah's diagnosis, through the mounting medical bills, through the lonely nights, when the enormity of preserving both his wife's health and his family's legacy threatened to crush him. The alfalfa looks good, Frank said finally, changing the subject. Best crop I've had in years, premium quality that should fetch top dollar. If the weather holds, I should have enough to cover the mortgage and put something towards Sarah's treatment. Daniel looked skeptical but didn't press further. He knew his brother well enough to recognize when a subject was closed. Instead, he reached into his truck and withdrew a small wrapped package. Early anniversary present, he said, pushing it across the table. Janice found it online. Frank unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photograph, a newly restored version of the oldest family photo they possessed, showing their grandfather standing proudly on the land he'd just purchased in 1932, 3 years before the house was built. Janice found someone who specializes in restoring old photographs, Daniel explained. Thought you might like to have it for the wall. Frank ran his finger along the frame, emotion tightening his throat. In the photo, William Mitchell stood, tall, despite his visible exhaustion, his eyes reflecting the same determination Frank saw in the mirror each morning. "Thank her for me," Frank managed, setting the photograph carefully on the table beside the family Bible that contained records of births, deaths, and harvests stretching back over 80 years. They talked for another hour about Daniel's construction business, about Sarah's upcoming doctor's appointment, about Melissa's summer plans to intern with an agricultural technology company. What remained unspoken was their shared fear that Frank might be the last Mitchell to work this land, that a legacy nearly a century in the making might end on his watch. After Daniel left, Frank returned to the irrigation system, losing himself in the physical demands of maintenance work. He was so focused on the task that he almost missed the soft footsteps approaching from the house. "I thought I might find you out here," Sarah Mitchell said, her voice still carrying the warm lilt that had first captured Frank's heart 23 years earlier. Frank turned, unable to prevent the smile that always came when he saw his wife. At 43, Sarah remained beautiful to him, her auburn hair now threaded with silver, her green eyes still bright despite the pain that often shadowed them. She moved, carefully, one hand resting on the walking stick she increasingly relied upon. "You should be resting," Frank said, wiping his hands on a rag as he rose to meet her. "I've rested enough," Sarah replied with a familiar, stubborn tilt to her chin. "It's too beautiful a day to spend it all in bed. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I heard Daniel's truck. I wanted to make sure you two weren't plotting behind my back." Frank guided her to the wooden bench he'd placed at the field's edge years ago when Sarah would bring lunch out during harvest season. "No plotting," he assured her, "just the usual brotherly catch-up." Sarah studied him with the perceptive gaze that had always seen through his attempts at concealment. "And the bank loan? Was that part of the brotherly catch-up too?" Frank sighed, settling beside her on the bench. There was little point in trying to shield Sarah from financial realities. She had managed the ranch's books until her condition had made the detailed work too difficult. "Mark's been talking," Frank admitted. "The bank's getting anxious about the mortgage." Sarah reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his with surprising strength. "The alfalfa looks good, premium quality." "That's what I told Daniel." "Then we'll be fine," Sarah said with a certainty Frank wished he could share. "One good harvest and we'll be back on track." Frank nodded, unwilling to dampen her optimism with his own doubts. Instead, he changed the subject. "Melissa called while you were resting. She aced her plant genetics final." Sarah's face brightened at the mention of their daughter. "Of course she did. She's a Mitchell, stubborn and brilliant. Just like her mother," Frank said, squeezing Sarah's hand gently. They sat together watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains, the peaceful moment a rare respite from the worries that defined their days. As dusk approached, Frank helped Sarah back to the house, each step measured and careful. Later that night, after Sarah had taken her medication and fallen into restless sleep, Frank sat at the kitchen table with the ranch's financial ledger open before him, the numbers illuminated by a single lamp. The columns of figures told a story, as clear as any family photograph. Willow Creek Ranch was sinking, weighed down by the dual anchors of agricultural economics and catastrophic medical expenses. Frank turned to a fresh page, beginning yet another round of calculations. If the alfalfa yielded as expected, if the irrigation held, if the organic dairy farms paid premium rates, if the bank granted one more extension, if Sarah's condition didn't worsen, if... His life had become an equation of uncertainties, a desperate mathematics of hope against probability. He closed the ledger with a quiet resignation. Tomorrow would bring a new day, new tasks, new problems to solve. The Mitchell family had weathered droughts, floods, market crashes, and personal tragedies. They would weather this too, somehow. Frank checked on Sarah one last time before settling into his own side of the bed, careful not to disturb her rare moment of peaceful sleep. As exhaustion finally claimed him, his last conscious thought was of his grandfather's favorite saying, "Land is the only thing that lasts. Take care of it, and it will take care of you." Frank only hoped the old man had been right. The next morning dawned clear and promising, the kind of perfect early summer day that reminded Frank why, despite everything, he had never regretted his choice to remain on the land his ancestors had settled. He rose before sunrise, as he had every day since childhood, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, coffee brewing, Max fed, equipment checked, and a hearty breakfast prepared for Sarah, who needed the nutrition even when her medication diminished her appetite. While Sarah slept, Frank reviewed the day's tasks. The western section of the irrigation system needed inspection. The barn roof had begun leaking during the last rainfall, and the fence along Silver Creek required reinforcement before the water level rose with the late spring runoff from the mountains. Silver Creek marked the southern boundary of Willow Creek Ranch, a usually gentle tributary that swelled dramatically during the snowmelt season. The creek had been named for its clarity, the water running so pure that the silver-colored stones lining its bed were visible even at its deepest points. It had been a source of joy in better times. Frank and Sarah had picnicked along its banks during their courtship, and Melissa had learned to swim in one of its wider, calmer pools. As Frank stepped onto the porch with his second cup of coffee, the ranch's old landline phone rang, an unusual occurrence so early in the morning. The caller was Lewis Parker, Frank's nearest neighbor, whose property adjoined Willow Creek Ranch to the east. "Frank?" Lewis's voice came through with unusual urgency. "Just wanted to warn you, National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for our area. That thunderstorm that passed north of us last night dropped nearly 8 inches on the high country. They're saying Silver Creek and the other tributaries will rise fast." Frank thanked Lewis for the warning, his mind already shifting to flood preparations. Silver Creek had overflowed its banks only twice in Frank's lifetime, but both events had caused significant damage to the lower fields. With the alfalfa crop representing his financial lifeline, he couldn't afford to lose any portion of it to flooding. After checking on Sarah, who was awake but having what she quietly described as "not one of my better mornings," Frank left her with a breakfast tray and promised to return soon. He spent the next 2 hours securing equipment that might be vulnerable to rising water and checking the integrity of the berms that had been built along the creek decades earlier. The water was already rising noticeably, its usual gentle murmur transformed into a more urgent rush. Still, the creek remained within its banks, and the berms appeared sound. Frank estimated he had several hours before the situation might become critical, enough time to repair the weakest sections of the protective earthworks. He was loading sandbags onto his truck when his cell phone rang. The screen showed Daniel's name, unusual for this time of day when his brother was typically at a construction site. "Everything okay?" Frank answered, immediately alert to the possibility of trouble. "Just checking on you," Daniel replied, his tone concerned. "They're broadcasting flood warnings for Silver Creek. How's it looking from your end?" "Rising, but manageable so far," Frank said, surveying the creek from his position. "I'm reinforcing the berms along the south field. Should hold unless things get dramatically worse." "Need an extra pair of hands. I can take a long lunch." Frank hesitated, his instinct to handle problems alone warring with practical necessity. "Actually, that might be helpful. Sarah's having a rough morning, and I don't want to leave her alone too long." "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Daniel promised, the relief in his voice making Frank realize how rarely he accepted his brother's offers of assistance. After hanging up, Frank returned to the house to check on Sarah. He found her seated in the living room chair near the window, her watercolor supplies arranged on the small table beside her. Before her illness, Sarah had been an accomplished artist, her landscapes of the Montana countryside selling well at regional galleries. Now she painted less frequently, but the activity still brought her joy on days when her hands were steady enough to hold a brush. "Creek's rising," Frank informed her, trying to keep his tone casual. "Daniel's coming out to help keep an eye on things." Sarah looked up from her painting, immediately alert to the implications. "How bad?" "Nothing we haven't handled before," Frank assured her, though the truth was more nuanced. The creek was rising faster than he'd anticipated, and the forecast warned of additional water coming from the mountains as the day progressed. Sarah set down her brush, studying him with the same perceptiveness that had seen through his evasions for over 2 decades of marriage. "Be careful," she said simply. "Both of you." Frank kissed her forehead gently. "Always am. I'll check in regularly, and my phone's in my pocket if you need anything." By the time Daniel arrived, the creek had risen another 6 inches, the water now moving with concerning speed. The brothers worked efficiently together, reinforcing vulnerable sections of the berm with sandbags and clearing debris that could cause damaging blockages. As noon approached, they paused briefly to assess their progress. The creek continued to rise, but their reinforcements appeared to be holding. The weather had changed, the clear morning sky now darkened by clouds moving in from the mountains, suggesting the possibility of additional rainfall that would only worsen the situation. "We should check the bridge," Daniel suggested, referring to the small wooden structure that crossed Silver Creek, connecting Willow Creek Ranch to the county road. Built decades earlier and reinforced periodically, the bridge was essential for accessing the eastern portion of the property, but vulnerable during flood conditions. Frank nodded in agreement, and they drove the half-mile to where the bridge spanned what was normally the widest, calmest section of the creek. What they found was alarming. The water had risen to within 2 feet of the bridge's underside, carrying debris that occasionally struck the supporting structure with concerning force. "This isn't good," Daniel observed unnecessarily. "If the water rises another foot, the bridge could be compromised." Frank was about to respond when a sound caught his attention, a child's voice calling for help. Both men turned toward the source, initially seeing nothing along the creek banks. Then Frank spotted movement about 50 yards upstream. A splash of bright color against the brown churning water. "There!" he pointed, already moving. Daniel followed, both men running along the bank until they could clearly see the situation. A child, a girl of perhaps 8 or 9, was clinging to a fallen tree that extended partway into the creek. The girl's position was precarious, the rushing water threatening to dislodge her tenuous grip with each passing moment. "Hold on!" Frank shouted. "We're coming to help you!" The girl's terrified face turned toward them, her expression momentarily relieved before another surge of water nearly dislodged her grip. She screamed, her small body shifting dangerously close to losing contact with the fallen tree. Frank assessed the situation rapidly. The child was too far from the bank for them to reach her without entering the water. The current was strong, and getting stronger. A direct approach would be dangerous, possibly fatal. They needed a plan, but there was no time for careful deliberation. "There's rope in my truck," Frank said to Daniel. "Get it, quickly. I'll try to get closer to her." As Daniel sprinted back toward the truck, Frank moved carefully along the bank, searching for the safest approach point. The girl watched him, with desperate hope, her knuckles white where they gripped the rough bark of the fallen tree. "What's your name?" Frank called, trying to keep her focused and calm. "Emma," the girl replied, her voice barely audible over the rushing water. "Hi, Emma, I'm Frank. That's my brother Daniel getting some rope. We're going to help you, but I need you to stay very still. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, her face pale with fear but determined. Frank had reached a point approximately 15 feet upstream from Emma's position, close enough to attempt a rescue, far enough that he wouldn't be swept immediately into her if he lost his footing. The water looked dangerously swift, but there was no alternative. Daniel returned with the rope, his face grim as he assessed what Frank was planning. "You can't go in there," he protested. "The current's too strong." "No choice," Frank replied tersely, already removing his boots and jacket. "Secure the rope around that oak," he instructed, pointing to a sturdy tree near the bank. "I'll tie it around my waist. If I get into trouble, pull me in." "This is insane," Daniel muttered, but he was already following Frank's instructions. Securing one end of the rope around the oak with practiced knots from their boyhood days, helping their father with livestock. "If something happens to me," Frank said quietly as Daniel handed him the rope's other end, "take care of Sarah and Melissa." Before Daniel could respond, a terrified scream from Emma split the air. The fallen tree had shifted with the rising water, and her grip was failing. There was no more time for discussion or preparation. Frank quickly secured the rope around his waist and waded into the creek. The cold was shocking, mountain runoff that stole his breath despite the summer air temperature. The current grabbed at his legs immediately, stronger than he'd anticipated, threatening to sweep him off his feet with each careful step. "Hold on, Emma!" he called, fighting to maintain his balance as the water rose past his knees, then his waist. The creek bottom was treacherous, slippery rocks shifting unpredictably beneath his feet. Emma's wide, terrified eyes were fixed on him, her small body trembling with the effort of maintaining her grip. She was perhaps 10 feet away now, but those 10 feet might as well have been a mile, given the force of the water between them. Frank took another step, and disaster struck. His foot found no purchase, sliding across a smooth stone, and the current immediately seized him. He plunged sideways into the rushing water, going completely under for a terrifying moment before. The rope around his waist went taut, Daniel's strength on the other end, preventing him from being swept downstream. Fighting against panic and the disorienting force of the water, Frank managed to regain his footing, now standing in water that reached his chest. He was closer to Emma now, perhaps 6 feet away, but at a dangerous angle, the current threatening to tear him away with each passing second. "I need slack," he shouted to Daniel, gesturing to the rope that now restricted his movement. Daniel hesitated visibly, then provided a few precious feet of additional line. Frank lunged forward, fighting against the current with every ounce of strength he possessed. His fingertips brushed the rough bark of the fallen tree, then gained purchase. Using the tree for added stability, he worked his way along it toward Emma, whose eyes had never left his face. "Almost there," he assured her, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "When I reach you, I need you to let go of the tree and hold on to me. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, though terror made her expression doubtful. "I won't let anything happen to you," Frank promised, finally reaching her position. "I've got a little girl too, and I'd want someone to help her if she was scared. Ready?" Another jerky nod from Emma. "On 3, okay? 1, 2, 3. Emma released her death grip on the tree and lunged toward Frank, her small arms wrapping around his neck with desperate strength. The sudden shift in weight nearly dislodged Frank's precarious position, but he managed to maintain his hold on the tree with one hand while securing Emma with his other arm. "Daniel!" he shouted. "Pull us in! Now!" The rope tightened as Daniel began the laborious process of hauling them toward shore against the creek's powerful current. Frank kept his focus on maintaining his grip on both Emma and the rope, whispering, reassurances to the terrified child clinging to him. The journey to shore seemed to take hours, though it was likely only minutes. Each step was a battle against the current, Frank's strength gradually failing as the cold water sapped his energy. Just when it seemed they might not make it, Daniel was there at the water's edge, reaching out to grasp Frank's arm and pull them the final distance to safety. They collapsed onto the muddy bank, Emma still clinging to Frank, her small body shaking with cold and fear. Daniel immediately wrapped his jacket around the child, his expression a mixture of relief and residual terror. "You're the craziest son of a—" Daniel began, then stopped himself, glancing at Emma. "You could have been killed." Frank, still trying to catch his breath, managed a weak smile. "Couldn't let her—" He broke off, unable to complete the thought, as the full reality of what had just occurred washed over him. Emma finally loosened her grip on Frank's neck, looking up at him with an expression of pure gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die." "What were you doing out here alone?" Daniel asked, his tone gentle despite the obvious question of why a young child was near a flooding creek without supervision. "I wasn't alone," Emma said, her eyes suddenly widening with renewed fear. "My dad, he was taking pictures of birds. We were just walking, and I went ahead, and then I slipped and—" She looked around frantically. "Where's my dad?" Frank and Daniel exchanged concerned glances. There had been no sign of another person in the area. "Where did you last see him?" Frank asked, struggling to his feet despite his exhaustion. Emma pointed vaguely upstream. "By the big rocks. He likes the birds that nest there." "We need to find him," Frank said to Daniel. "He might be hurt or searching for her elsewhere." Daniel nodded, helping Emma to her feet. "We should get her to the house first. She needs to warm up, and Sarah can look after her while we search." Frank agreed, and they made their way quickly, back to his truck. As they approached Willow Creek Ranch, Frank's satellite phone rang. The emergency service was one of the few reliable communications options in their remote location when cell service was compromised by weather. The caller was Lewis Parker again, his voice urgent. "Frank, I just found a man wandering along my eastern property line, looking for his daughter. Says she was swept into Silver Creek. I told him I hadn't seen her, but that you were working along the creek this morning. He's frantic. I'm bringing him over to your place now." "We found her," Frank said, relief evident in his voice. "She's safe. We've got her with us." There was a commotion on the other end of the line as Lewis apparently relayed this information to Emma's father. Moments later, a different voice came through, cultured, with a slight Eastern accent, nearly incoherent with relief. "You have Emma? She's safe? Oh, thank God. Is she hurt? Please tell me she's okay." "She's cold and scared, but doesn't appear to be injured," Frank assured the anxious father. "We're taking her to my house now. My wife's a former nurse. She'll check her over to be sure." "I'll be there in minutes," the man promised. "Lewis is driving me. Please, tell Emma her dad is coming." Frank relayed the message to Emma, whose face brightened immediately despite her ordeal. "That's my dad," she confirmed, huddling deeper into Daniel's jacket. "He's a doctor. He fixes people's brains." Frank raised an eyebrow at this information, but focused on getting Emma back to the ranch house as quickly as possible. By the time they arrived, the sky had darkened further, and a light rain had begun to fall, promising to worsen the flooding situation that had momentarily been forgotten. In the drama of Emma's rescue, Sarah was waiting anxiously on the porch, alerted by a quick call Frank had made once they were in the truck. Despite her own physical limitations, she immediately took charge of caring for Emma, wrapping the child in warm blankets and preparing hot chocolate, while Frank changed into dry clothes. "You're going to be just fine," Sarah assured Emma, with the confident, gentle tone she had once used with pediatric patients during her nursing career. "Your dad will be here any minute, and in the meantime, you're safe with us." Emma seemed to respond to Sarah's calm presence, her trembling subsiding as she sipped the hot chocolate. "Mr. Frank jumped in the water to save me," she told Sarah solemnly. "He was really brave." Sarah's eyes met Frank's over Emma's head, her expression a complex mixture of pride and what might have been fear, the belated recognition of what could have happened. Before they could speak, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. Lewis Parker's truck pulled into the driveway, barely coming to a complete stop before the passenger door flew open and a man leaped out, running toward the house with desperate speed. "Emma!" the man shouted as he reached the porch. "Daddy!" Emma set down her mug and rushed to meet her father, who gathered her into his arms with a sob of relief so raw it made Frank look away, feeling like an intruder on a deeply private moment. For long moments, father and daughter simply clung to each other, the man murmuring reassurances and checking her for injuries with gentle, practiced hands. Finally, he looked up, his tear-streaked face turning toward Frank with an expression of profound gratitude. "You saved my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can never repay you for that." Frank shook his head, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," the man said firmly, still holding Emma close. "What Lewis told me about the conditions of the creek, about what you risked, that wasn't just anyone. That was extraordinary." He carefully released Emma with one arm, extending his hand to Frank. "I'm James Harrington, and I owe you everything." As Frank shook the offered hand, he was struck by the name. Something about it seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place it. James Harrington was a tall man in his mid-40s, with prematurely silver hair and intelligent blue eyes, currently reddened from emotional tears. His clothing, though now muddy and disheveled, was clearly expensive and well-tailored. "Frank Mitchell," he replied simply, "and this is my wife Sarah and my brother Daniel. We're just glad Emma's safe." Dr. Harrington's gaze shifted to Sarah, a brief but professional assessment passing over his features as he noted the walking stick propped against her chair and the careful way she held herself. If he had questions, he kept them to himself, focused instead on expressing his gratitude. "I'd like to have Emma checked at a hospital," he said, "just as a precaution. Is there one nearby?" "Riverdale Memorial is about 30 miles from here," Daniel supplied. "I can guide you there if you need directions." Dr. Harrington nodded gratefully. "I'd appreciate that. I'm not familiar with the area. We're just here for a few days. I was speaking at a medical conference in Bozeman, and we decided to take a short detour to do some birdwatching before heading home to Boston." As they made arrangements for Daniel to lead Dr. Harrington to the hospital, the rain intensified outside, a sharp reminder of the ongoing flood threat. Frank excused himself briefly to check the weather radar on his satellite phone, confirming his fears. The storm system was stalling over their region, promising additional rainfall that would only worsen the flooding along Silver Creek. When he returned, Dr. Harrington was preparing to leave with Emma, who was now wrapped in a blanket Sarah had insisted they take. The doctor hesitated at the door, turning back to Frank with an expression of sincere gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you properly," he said. "What you did today—" He broke off, emotion threatening to overcome him again. "If there's ever anything I can do for you or your family, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. I mean that sincerely." Frank nodded, accepting the business card Dr. Harrington pressed into his hand without looking at it. "Just glad I was in the right place," he said simply. "Take care of your daughter." As Dr. Harrington and Emma departed, following Daniel's truck, Frank turned his attention back to the more immediate concern of protecting the ranch from the worsening flood. Sarah watched him from her chair, her expression troubled. "You're going back out there, aren't you?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Frank nodded, already pulling on his rain gear. "Have to check the berms, make sure the alfalfa." Fields are protected. This storm isn't letting up anytime soon. Sarah's hand caught his as he passed her chair. "Frank," she said softly, "what you did today. It was remarkable and terrifying. Please be careful out there." Frank squeezed, her hand gently bending to kiss her forehead. "Always am. I'll be back before dark." As he headed back to Silver Creek in the strengthening rain, Frank's thoughts remained divided, concern for the ranch, warring with lingering images of Emma's terrified face as she clung to that fallen tree. He had acted without hesitation, without calculation of risk or consequence. Some things transcended the careful mathematics of survival that had defined his recent years. Some instincts ran deeper than self-preservation. The creek had risen further during his absence, now threatening to overtop the berms in several locations. Frank worked alone through the afternoon, reinforcing vulnerable sections, clearing debris, and monitoring water levels with grim determination. By the time darkness began to fall, he was exhausted, soaked despite his rain gear, and forced to acknowledge that he had done everything humanly possible. The rest was up to nature's whims. He returned to the house to find Sarah waiting anxiously, dinner keeping warm in the oven. "Daniel called," she informed him as he shed his wet outer layers. "Dr. Harrington took Emma to Riverdale Memorial. She's fine, mild hypothermia and some scrapes, but nothing serious. They're keeping her overnight just as a precaution." Frank nodded, relief washing through him at this confirmation of Emma's well-being. "And the creek?" Sarah's expression sobered. "Lewis called too. The National Weather Service upgraded the warning. They're expecting Silver Creek to crest sometime, around midnight, potentially at historic levels." Frank absorbed this news grimly. "If it overtops the berms." "The south field will flood," Sarah finished for him. "I know." Frank awoke before dawn, his body aching from the previous days. Exertions. He moved carefully to avoid waking Sarah, though he suspected she'd slept as poorly as he had, listening to the relentless rain drumming on the roof throughout the night. The clock read 5:17 a.m. He'd managed perhaps 3 hours of restless sleep, his dreams haunted by rushing water and a child's terrified scream. The first task was to assess the damage. Frank dressed quickly in the darkness, his movements practiced from decades of pre-dawn risings. Max greeted him at the bedroom door, the Australian shepherd sensing his master's tension. Together, they moved through the quiet house and onto the porch, where the true scope of the situation revealed itself in the grey morning light. Silver Creek had indeed overtopped its banks during the night. The lower portion of the south field, nearly 15 acres of his precious alfalfa crop, lay submerged beneath muddy water. The sight hit Frank like a physical blow, each submerged plant representing dollars lost. Another step toward foreclosure, another treatment for Sarah that would remain out of reach. "How bad?" Sarah's voice came from behind him. She stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on her walking stick, her face drawn with the pain that typically accompanied her first movements of the day. 15 acres, maybe more," Frank replied, unable to soften the truth. "South fields under water." Sarah moved carefully to join him at the porch railing, her free hand finding his in a gesture of solidarity that transcended words. They stood, together in silence, watching the water shimmer in the strengthening dawn light, a beautiful devastation. "We've weathered floods before," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying a conviction Frank wished he could share. "Not with the mortgage." 3 months behind," Frank countered softly. "Not with your medical bills piling up?" Sarah's hand tightened around his. "We'll find a way, Frank. We always have." Before Frank could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. Daniel's truck appeared through the morning mist, navigating the partially flooded access road with careful precision. Frank felt a surge of gratitude for his brother's presence. Despite their occasional differences, Daniel had always shown up when it mattered most. "Couldn't sleep," Daniel explained as he joined them on the porch, his expression grim as he surveyed the flooded fields. "Figured you'd be assessing the damage at first light." 15 acres minimum, Frank informed him. "Probably more once the water recedes enough to get a proper look." Daniel nodded, processing this information with the practical mindset that characterized the Mitchell family. "What's the plan?" It was the question Frank had been asking himself since awakening. The insurance wouldn't cover crop loss from flooding. The premiums for such coverage had been beyond his means for years. The bank was unlikely to grant another extension with this setback, regardless of the circumstances. The treatment program in Denver that represented Sarah's best hope remained impossibly expensive. "I don't know," Frank admitted, the words costing him more than either his wife or brother could understand. Frank Mitchell always had a plan. It was the cornerstone of his identity, the trait that had kept Willow Creek Ranch functioning through countless hardships. Sarah squeezed his hand again before turning toward the house. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "Whatever comes next, you two need to eat." As Sarah disappeared inside, Daniel turned to Frank with an expression that brooked no evasion. "Level. With me, Frank? How bad is it really?" Frank hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Bank's giving me until the end of the month, with the crop damaged. I don't see a way forward, Danny, not this time." The admission hung between them, heavier than the morning mist. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, his gaze on the submerged fields, but his mind clearly elsewhere. "There are options," he began carefully. "If you're about to suggest selling part of the property—" "That's not what I was going to say," Daniel interrupted, "though it might come to that eventually. I was going to suggest talking to Dr. Harrington." Frank blinked, momentarily confused. "Emma's father? What does he have to do with this?" "You didn't look at his card, did you?" Daniel asked, a hint of exasperation in his tone. Frank shook his head. In the chaos of the flood preparations, he'd tossed the business card onto his desk without examining it. "Dr. James Harrington," Daniel said deliberately, "is the head of neurosurgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. He's one of the country's leading experts in experimental treatments for rare neurological conditions. He was in Bozeman speaking at a conference on precisely the type of conditions Sarah has." The information hit Frank with the force of the floodwaters that had devastated his fields. "How do you know all this?" "Because while you were out reinforcing berms yesterday evening, I looked him up," Daniel replied. "Then I called his office in Boston this morning. His assistant confirmed he's the principal investigator for an experimental treatment protocol that's showing remarkable results in cases like Sarah's." Frank absorbed this information slowly, possibilities and implications unfolding in his mind. Even if that's true, what good does it do us? Those trial programs cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there are waiting lists years long. "For most people, yes," Daniel acknowledged, "but not for the daughter of the man who saved the chief surgeon's daughter from drowning." Frank shook his head, uncomfortable with the implication. "I didn't save Emma so her father would feel obligated to help Sarah." "Of course you didn't," Daniel agreed readily. "But that doesn't change the fact that he does feel obligated. He meant what he said yesterday, Frank. Anything at all." Those were his words. Before Frank could formulate a response, Sarah called them in for breakfast. The conversation shifted to more immediate concerns. Which portions of the alfalfa crop might be salvageable, how soon the water might recede, whether the irrigation system had sustained damage beyond repair. Throughout the meal, Frank remained uncharacteristically quiet, Daniel's suggestions regarding Dr. Harrington churning in his mind alongside images of submerged alfalfa plants and the upcoming bank deadline. Sarah noticed his preoccupation, but attributed it to the flood damage, not pressing him for conversation as they ate. After breakfast, the brothers headed out to begin the grim task of assessing the full extent of the damage. The water had begun to recede, revealing muddy fields, strewn with debris carried downstream by the flooding creek. The sight was disheartening. Even the plants that hadn't been completely submerged were likely damaged beyond recovery from the force of the water and the silt deposited around their roots. 20 acres, Frank estimated as they surveyed the south field from its elevated northwestern corner. Maybe 25, nearly half the alfalfa crop. Daniel let out a low whistle. Any chance of replanting and getting a harvest before fall? Frank shook his head. Too late in the season. By the time the field's dry enough to work, we'd be looking at an August planting at best. First frost usually hits by early October. Not enough growing time. They worked in silence for the next few hours, clearing debris where possible and documenting the damage for insurance purposes, though both knew the claim would be denied. Around midday, they paused for water, sitting on the tailgate of Frank's truck with the devastated fields spread before them. "You need to call him," Daniel said without preamble. Frank didn't pretend to misunderstand. "It feels wrong, Danny, using Emma's rescue as leverage." "It's not leverage," Daniel countered. "It's accepting help that's freely offered. There's a difference. And if the situations were reversed, if I were the doctor and he were the farmer with the flooded fields, would the help still be freely offered, or would it be charity?" Daniel sighed, exasperation evident in his expression. "This isn't about pride, Frank. This is about Sarah's life, about Melissa's mother, about your wife." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If your positions were reversed and you could help the man who saved your child, wouldn't you move heaven and earth to do it?" The question struck Frank with unexpected force. Of course he would, without hesitation. If someone had saved Melissa from drowning, there would be no limit to what Frank would do in return. "I need to think about it," he said finally. Daniel nodded, accepting this as the concession it was. "That's fair, but don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come along often." They returned to work, focusing on salvaging what equipment had been affected by the flood and preparing the untouched fields for the continued summer growing season. Despite the significant loss, Willow Creek Ranch still had viable crops that needed attention, the unforgiving rhythm of agricultural life continuing regardless of personal crises. That evening, after Daniel had departed and Sarah had retired early, exhausted by the emotional strain of the day, Frank sat at his desk in the small room that served as the ranch's office. Before him lay two objects that represented starkly different futures: the ranch's financial ledger, its recent entries a chronicle of steady decline, and Dr. Harrington's business card, embossed with the prestigious hospital logo and contact information. Frank opened the ledger first, forcing himself to confront the numbers that had kept him awake for countless nights. With the loss of the alfalfa crop, there was no mathematical path to meeting the bank's deadline. The cold reality of this marked the potential end of nearly a century of Mitchell family stewardship of this land. Setting the ledger aside, Frank picked up Dr. Harrington's card, turning it over in his fingers as he considered Daniel's words. Was it truly wrong to accept help that might save Sarah's life, simply because it came in response to a selfless act? Where was the line between appropriate gratitude and uncomfortable obligation? Frank's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Sarah's uneven footsteps in the hallway. He looked up to find her standing in the doorway, her expression troubled. "I thought you were asleep," he said, rising to help her to the small leather armchair opposite his desk. "I was," Sarah replied, settling into the chair with a wince of discomfort. "But then I started thinking about that little girl, about what could have happened if you hadn't been there." She looked up at him, her eyes suspiciously bright. "I'm proud of you, Frank. I don't think I said that yesterday." Frank shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. I just did what anyone would do. No, Sarah countered with unexpected firmness. Not anyone would wade into a flooding creek to save a child they'd never met. That was you, the man I married, the man who never hesitates when someone needs help. She paused, her gaze falling to the desk where the ledger and business card lay. The man who never asks for help himself, even when he desperately needs it. Frank followed her gaze, realization dawning. Daniel told you about Dr. Harrington. Sarah nodded. He called while you were checking the north field, asked if I'd talk some sense into you. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. As if I've ever been able to do that. Despite everything, Frank found himself returning her smile. Sarah's gentle stubbornness had been one of the first things he'd fallen in love with, decades earlier when she'd arrived in Riverdale as a new nurse at the county hospital. It feels wrong, Frank admitted, sinking back into his chair, using what happened with Emma as a way to get special treatment for you. Is that what you think this is? Sarah asked, her tone suggesting she saw the situation differently. Frank, when someone offers help out of genuine gratitude, refusing them doesn't make you noble. It denies them the chance to express that gratitude in a meaningful way. Frank considered this perspective, turning it over in his mind like a stone found in a field, examining it for flaws or hidden value. Besides, Sarah continued with deceptive casualness, if Dr. Harrington is as prominent in his field as Daniel says, he might be able to offer a professional consultation. That's not charity, it's a second opinion. Frank recognized the diplomat's approach Sarah was taking, framing the potential interaction in terms his pride might be able to accept. The hint of manipulation might have bothered him if it hadn't been so transparently motivated by love. Before he could respond, the ranch's landline phone rang, an unusual occurrence so late in the evening. Frank rose to answer it, puzzled by who might be calling. Mitchell Residence, he answered, the traditional greeting feeling strangely formal on his lips. Mr. Mitchell, this is Dr. James Harrington. The cultured voice was immediately recognizable, though it carried a note of uncertainty. I hope I'm not calling too late. I tried your cell phone but couldn't get through. Reception's spotty out here, Frank explained, catching Sarah's questioning look and mouthing Harrington to her. How's Emma doing? She's wonderful, Dr. Harrington replied, audible relief in his voice. The hospital released her this morning. No lasting effects beyond a few bruises and quite the story to tell her friends back home. He paused briefly. Mr. Mitchell, I'm calling because, well, frankly, I can't stop thinking about what you did, about what might have happened if you hadn't been there. Frank shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the subject of such focused gratitude. Just glad I could help. You did far more than help, Mr. Mitchell. You risked your life to save my daughter. I don't know how to properly express what that means to me. Frank remained silent, sensing the doctor had more to say. I understand, from speaking with your brother yesterday, that your wife has been diagnosed with a neurological condition, Dr. Harrington continued carefully. He didn't share specifics appropriately, but mentioned it was something that might benefit from specialized treatment. Frank shot Sarah a startled look, which she returned with a small shrug that conveyed both innocence and a hint of, I told you so. The conversation between Daniel and Dr. Harrington had evidently been more extensive than Daniel had let on. Sarah was diagnosed with progressive cerebellar ataxia 2 years ago, Frank confirmed, seeing little point in denial. It's a rare variant that's proving resistant to standard treatments. I see. Dr. Harrington's voice took on a more professional tone, though the underlying warmth remained. Mr. Mitchell, my field of specialty is precisely these kinds of atypical neurological conditions. In fact, my research team at Mass General is currently conducting a clinical trial for an innovative treatment protocol that's showing promising results for conditions similar to your wife's. Frank's heart began to race, hope and suspicion warring in his chest. What exactly are you suggesting, Dr. Harrington? I'd like to offer Mrs. Mitchell a consultation, the doctor replied promptly. At minimum, I could review her records and provide a second opinion. If appropriate, I might be able to consider her for inclusion in our clinical trial program. Those programs have waiting lists years long, Frank said, echoing his earlier conversation with Daniel. And they cost. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Harrington interrupted gently, as the principal investigator, I have some discretion regarding participant selection. And for trial participants, the treatment costs are covered by our research grant. The implication was clear, though tactfully presented. Dr. Harrington was offering Sarah a place in a treatment program that might otherwise be inaccessible to her, both financially and logistically. Frank felt momentarily lightheaded, the possibility of real help for Sarah colliding with his deeply ingrained independence. Sarah was watching him intently from her chair, unable to hear Dr. Harrington's side of the conversation, but clearly, understanding its significance from Frank's expression. That's very generous, Frank managed finally, but I wouldn't want you to feel obligated because of what happened with Emma. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Harrington said firmly, if you're concerned that I'm offering special treatment because you saved my daughter, you're absolutely right. I am. The frank admission caught Frank off guard, but that doesn't make the offer any less medically sound. Your wife would be an appropriate candidate for our program based on her diagnosis alone. The fact that I have a personal reason to want to help your family doesn't change the professional validity of the treatment. Frank found himself without a ready response, his usual defenses against accepting help dismantled by the doctor's straightforward approach. Would it help if I spoke with Mrs. Mitchell directly? Dr. Harrington suggested into the silence. As a former nurse, she might appreciate the medical details of what we're offering. Frank looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and concern. Actually, she's right here, he said. I think that might be good. Frank passed the phone to Sarah, who took it with steady hands, despite the emotion clear in her eyes. As she began speaking with Dr. Harrington, her expression shifting between professional interest and cautious optimism, Frank stepped onto the porch to give her privacy and to clear his own swirling thoughts. The night was clear, the stars brilliant. In the aftermath of the storm that had devastated his fields, but might, through a series of events no one could have predicted, offer new hope for Sarah. Frank tried to reconcile the disparate realities: crop failure, potential foreclosure, and now this unexpected lifeline for his wife's health. His father's voice seemed to echo in the night air. A farmer learns to accept what can't be controlled and to be grateful for unexpected blessings. William Mitchell had faced his own catastrophes, droughts, market crashes, equipment failures, but had somehow maintained an unshakable faith in the balance of fortune. Bad luck and good rarely travel alone, he'd often said. Keep your eyes open for both. When Sarah finally joined him on the porch nearly 40 minutes later, her face told him everything he needed to know before she spoke a single word. There was a light in her eyes he hadn't seen in months, perhaps years, the rekindling of hope long suppressed. He wants us to come to Boston next week, she said without preamble. All the preliminary tests, my complete medical history. He's already requested everything from my doctors here. Frank, he thinks I might be an ideal candidate for their trial. The joy in her voice melted the last of Frank's resistance. Whatever. His pride might cost him. It would never be worth denying Sarah this chance. Then we'll go to Boston, he said simply. Sarah moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture that spoke volumes about her relief. There's more, she said softly. "He wants to help with the ranch too." Frank stiffened slightly. "What does that mean?" "He asked about the flood damage, about our situation with the bank," Sarah explained. "He was very diplomatic, but it was clear Daniel had filled him in on some of the details." She looked up at Frank, her expression both apologetic and determined. "He offered to make a private loan to cover the mortgage payments while we're in Boston for my treatment. No interest, flexible repayment terms." Frank's instinct was immediate rejection, but the words died before reaching his lips. The reflexive pride that had guided so many of his decisions suddenly seemed hollow when weighed against their current reality. Was his self-image as the independent rancher truly worth risking both Sarah's health and the family legacy? "I told him we'd discuss it," Sarah continued, correctly reading his silence. "Frank, I know what the ranch means to you, what it means to us both. But if there's a way to save it and pursue this treatment—" "It's a lot to accept from someone we barely know," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah nodded against his shoulder. "It is. But he's not offering because we're charity cases, Frank. He's offering because his daughter is alive because of you. Can you imagine what that means to a parent?" She paused, letting the question sink in. "If someone had saved Melissa, wouldn't you want to help them any way you could?" It was the same question Daniel had posed earlier, but coming from Sarah, it carried different weight. Frank thought of Melissa, their daughter whose determination and intelligence had earned her a place at the state university. What wouldn't he have done for someone who saved her life? "We should sleep on it," Frank said finally. "Make sure we're thinking clearly." Sarah nodded, accepting this moderate response as progress. Together, they returned inside, the decision not yet fully made, but the direction becoming clear. As Frank lay beside Sarah that night, listening to her breathing finally deepen into restful sleep, he found his thoughts drifting to the current that had nearly claimed Emma Harrington's young life. Water always found a path forward, no matter the obstacles. Perhaps, Frank reflected, it was time for him to learn from the very forces that had threatened his livelihood, to find a new path forward, even if it meant carving an unexpected channel through the bedrock of his pride. The morning would bring clearer thoughts and final decisions, but for now the possibility of help for Sarah cast its glow over every other concern, illuminating a future that just yesterday had seemed impossibly dark. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Frank Mitchell fell asleep not with resignation, but with a tentative, fragile hope. The week following Dr. Harrington's call passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Frank feeling as though he'd stepped into someone else's life. After a long night of soul-searching and a morning conversation with Sarah that had brought them both to tears, he'd called the doctor back to accept both the offer of medical consultation and the financial assistance for the ranch. Decisions that had felt simultaneously like surrender and like the most courageous choice he'd ever made. Daniel had been instrumental in helping arrange for the ranch's care during their absence, recruiting 2 experienced hands from neighboring properties to maintain the remaining crops and livestock. Melissa had arrived home from university, initially, concerned by the urgency of her parents' summons, then overjoyed by the possibility of real help for her mother. She would remain at Willow Creek Ranch during their time in Boston, overseeing operations with Daniel's support and applying her agricultural studies to the challenge of reclaiming the flood-damaged fields. Now, 7 days after the flooding, that had threatened to claim both his livelihood and a young girl's life, Frank found himself sitting beside Sarah in the first-class cabin of a flight to Boston, tickets provided by Dr. Harrington, despite Frank's insistence that economy would have been perfectly adequate. "You're gripping the armrest like it might escape," Sarah observed with gentle amusement as the plane reached cruising altitude. "For someone who routinely climbs onto the barn roof during windstorms, you're surprisingly anxious about flying." Frank loosened his white-knuckled grip with conscious effort. On the barn roof, I'm in control. Up here, I'm just cargo. Sarah laughed, a genuine, unreserved sound that Frank realized he hadn't heard in months. The prospect of specialized treatment had already transformed her in subtle ways, rekindling the spark that had been gradually dimming as her condition progressed. Well, this particular cargo is about to be delivered to one of the top neurological treatment centers in the country, she reminded him, her hand finding his. Whatever happens in Boston, Frank, thank you for being willing to try this. Frank squeezed her hand gently, still marveling at the chain of events that had brought them here. I should be thanking you for not giving up on me. My stubbornness nearly cost us this opportunity. Your stubbornness has kept Willow Creek Ranch alive through worse crises than this flood, Sarah countered. It's just that sometimes that same quality needs a little redirection. The flight attendant approached with a tray of beverages, interrupting their conversation. Frank accepted a coffee with awkward thanks, still uncomfortable with the attentive service that seemed to characterize this unfamiliar world of first-class travel. As the plane continued eastward, Frank found himself reflecting on the conversation. With the bank that had preceded their departure, Mark Sinclair had been initially skeptical when Frank explained the arrangement with Dr. Harrington, but the arrival of certified funds covering 6 months of mortgage payments had quickly transformed his doubt into surprise cooperation. The bank had agreed to a 6-month pause on foreclosure proceedings, giving Willow Creek Ranch the breathing room it desperately needed. You look lost in thought, Sarah observed, as the landscape below transitioned from the familiar mountains of Montana to the patchwork farmland of the Midwest. Just thinking about how quickly everything's changed, Frank admitted. A week ago, I was reinforcing berms along Silver Creek and wondering how we'd make it to the end of the month. Now, we're flying to Boston for cutting-edge medical treatment. While Melissa manages the ranch, it's disorienting, Sarah supplied when he struggled to find the right word. I know. I keep thinking I'll wake up and find it was all just a hopeful dream. Frank squeezed her hand again. Not a dream. Just a very strange reality. The remainder of the flight passed uneventfully, though Frank never quite adjusted to the sensation of hurtling through the sky in a metal tube with nothing but physics between them and disaster. By the time they began their descent into Boston, his back ached from unconscious tension, but Sarah's hand in his provided an anchor that kept his anxiety manageable. Logan International Airport was unlike anything in their experience, a gleaming, bustling metropolis of travelers moving with urban purposefulness that made Frank feel conspicuously out of place in his comfortable but distinctly Western attire. As they navigated the terminal toward baggage claim, Frank was grateful for the detailed instructions Dr. Harrington had provided, complete with photographs of landmarks to guide their path. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. They turned to find a professionally dressed young woman holding a small sign with their names. She smiled warmly, extending her hand. I'm Rebecca Winters, Dr. Harrington's patient coordinator. He asked me to meet you and help with transportation to your accommodations. Frank accepted the handshake with a mixture of relief and lingering discomfort at being treated with such consideration. That's very kind, but we could have taken a taxi. Rebecca's smile didn't falter. Dr. Harrington was quite insistent. He wanted to ensure you arrived without any unnecessary stress after your journey. She gestured toward the exit. The car is waiting just outside, and your luggage will be collected for you. Sarah shot Frank a cautioning glance that clearly communicated, don't argue, so he simply nodded his thanks and followed Rebecca toward the terminal exit. Outside, a sleek black car awaited them, its driver already moving to open the door as they approached. Your hotel is about 20 minutes from the hospital, Rebecca explained as they settled into the vehicle's leather interior. Dr. Harrington has arranged for you to have today to rest, with your first appointment scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. I've prepared a folder with all the details, your schedule, hospital maps, local information and contact numbers for myself and Dr. Harrington's office. She handed Frank a leather portfolio embossed with the hospital's logo. The thoroughness of the arrangements was simultaneously impressive and slightly overwhelming, further evidence of how far they'd traveled from the straightforward rhythms of ranch life. The drive from the airport provided Frank and Sarah with their first glimpses of Boston, a city of historic brick buildings and gleaming modern towers existing in remarkable harmony. The driver navigated through traffic with practiced ease, while Rebecca pointed out landmarks and offered contextual history that suggested she'd performed this orientation many times for out-of-town patients. Their hotel, when they arrived, proved to be another revelation, an elegant establishment whose understated luxury made Frank profoundly conscious of his worn jeans and scuffed boots. The staff, however, greeted them with genuine warmth, and the suite prepared for them overlooked the Charles River with a view that even Frank, hardly given to architectural appreciation, found impressive. "This is too much," he murmured to Sarah. Once they were alone, the bellhop having departed after delivering their luggage, Sarah moved to the window, gazing out at the river with undisguised wonder. "Maybe," she agreed, "but can we just accept it? Just for now. It's not forever." "Frank, it's just to give us the best possible chance at this treatment working." Looking at her silhouetted against the Boston skyline, Frank felt something shift within him, a softening of the rigid self-reliance that had defined him for so long. Sarah deserved this chance, this comfort, this hope. If accepting help was the price for potentially restoring her health, it was a bargain he would make without hesitation. "You're right," he said, moving to join her at the window. "We'll accept it gratefully and focus on why we're here." Sarah leaned against him, her fatigue from the journey evident in the slight tremor of her hands and the careful way she distributed her weight. "What I wouldn't give for a hot bath and about 12 hours of sleep right now." Frank smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That sounds like an excellent plan." Later that evening, after Sarah had rested and they'd shared a meal in the hotel's restaurant, Frank's phone rang with a call from Dr. Harrington. "Mr. Mitchell, welcome to Boston," the doctor greeted him warmly. "I hope your journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all," Frank assured him, though his aching back told a different story. "The arrangements you've made are incredibly generous." "It's the least I can do," Dr. Harrington replied. "I wanted to check in personally and see if you had any questions before tomorrow's appointment. I understand that medical settings can be intimidating, especially in unfamiliar surroundings." Frank glanced at Sarah, who was listening to his side of the conversation with evident interest. "I think we're as prepared as we can be. Sarah's background in nursing helps. She understands the medical terminology better than I do." "Of course," Dr. Harrington acknowledged. "Well, I'll be meeting with you both after the initial evaluations tomorrow. My colleague, Dr. Patel, will be conducting the preliminary examinations, and then we'll discuss treatment options based on those results." There was a brief pause before the doctor continued, his tone shifting slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, Frank, if I may, I want to assure you again that while my gratitude for Emma's rescue certainly expedited this process, the treatment program we're considering for your wife is based entirely on medical criteria. I wouldn't offer false hope or inappropriate interventions, regardless of personal feelings." The clarification answered an unspoken concern that had lingered in Frank's mind. "I appreciate that, Doctor. And please, call me Frank." "James, then," the doctor responded. "And how is Willow Creek Ranch faring in your absence? Your daughter is managing things, I understand?" The genuine interest in his tone suggested this wasn't merely polite conversation, but a sincere attempt to acknowledge the sacrifice Frank had made in leaving his land during such a critical time. "Melissa's doing remarkably well," Frank confirmed, pride evident in his voice. "She's implementing some soil remediation techniques she learned at university that might save more of the damaged fields than I initially thought possible." "Excellent," Dr. Harrington James replied warmly. "Perhaps when all this is behind us, Emma and I might visit Montana again under better circumstances. She's developed quite an interest in farm animals since our adventure." The casual suggestion of future connection caught Frank off guard. In his experience, relationships forged through crisis rarely extended beyond its resolution. Yet James seemed to be proposing a genuine friendship, independent of the medical treatment he was offering Sarah. "You'd both be welcome any time," Frank said, surprised to find he meant it sincerely. After the call ended, Sarah emerged from the bathroom wrapped in one of the hotel's plush robes, her damp hair framing a face that looked more relaxed than it had in months. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting Frank's thoughtful expression. Frank nodded, still processing the conversation. "Just Dr. Harrington checking in. He'll see us tomorrow after the initial evaluations." He hesitated, then added, "He invited us to call him James, and he mentioned possibly visiting the ranch someday with Emma." Sarah settled onto the edge of the bed, a small smile playing at her lips. "You sound surprised." "I am, I suppose," Frank admitted. "This whole situation, it's not just transactional for him. He seems genuinely interested in, well, in us as people, not just as the recipients of his gratitude or charity." "Is that so hard to believe?" Sarah asked gently. "That someone might simply want to know the man who saved his daughter, the man who didn't hesitate to risk his own life for a child he'd never met?" She reached for his hand, drawing him to sit beside her. "That man is pretty extraordinary, Frank. More people would see that if you'd let them get close enough." Frank felt heat rise in his face at her praise. "I just did what needed doing," he demurred. "And that," Sarah said, kissing his weathered cheek, "is exactly why you're extraordinary." The next morning brought a return of Frank's anxiety as they prepared for Sarah's first appointment at Massachusetts General Hospital. The facility itself was imposing, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings that seemed to occupy half the neighborhood. Without Rebecca waiting to meet them at the entrance, Frank suspected they might have wandered the corridors for hours before finding the correct department. Dr. Nadia Patel, a neurologist specializing in movement disorders, greeted them with brisk efficiency that nevertheless conveyed genuine compassion. Her examination of Sarah was thorough, combining traditional neurological assessments with advanced imaging techniques that Frank recognized from previous consultations with specialists in Montana and Denver. What differed, however, was the comprehensive nature of the evaluation and the cutting-edge technology available. By early afternoon, Dr. Patel had compiled more detailed information about Sarah's condition than all her previous medical visits combined. "You have an interesting presentation, Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Patel observed as she reviewed results on her computer screen. "The cerebellar ataxia diagnosis is accurate, but there are several features of your case that suggest you might be an excellent candidate for our experimental protocol, specifically because your variant doesn't respond well to conventional treatments." Sarah leaned forward, her medical background evident in the precision of her questions. "The progression rate has increased over the past 6 months. Does that affect eligibility for the trial?" Dr. Patel shook her head. "Actually, the accelerated progression makes you a more suitable candidate. Our protocol specifically targets cases where conventional treatments have failed to slow disease advancement." Frank listened, understanding perhaps one word in 3 of the technical discussion that followed, but recognizing hope in Sarah's expression as she engaged with Dr. Patel on the medical details. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, they were speaking with someone who viewed her condition not as a devastating verdict, but as a challenge to be confronted with innovation and determination. When Dr. Harrington, James, joined them, late in the afternoon, the atmosphere shifted subtly. While Dr. Patel had been professionally compassionate, James brought a personal warmth that transformed the clinical consultation into something more akin to a family conference. "Sarah, Frank," he greeted them, shaking their hands before settling into a chair. "Dr. Patel has briefed me on her findings. I've reviewed your previous medical records as well, and I believe we have good reason for optimism." Frank felt Sarah's hand tighten around his at these words, simple syllables that represented the first genuine hope they'd encountered in their 2-year medical journey. "The treatment protocol we're proposing combines advanced immunotherapy with targeted neurological stimulation," James explained. "In simple terms, we're retraining the immune system to stop attacking neural pathways, while simultaneously encouraging new pathways to develop around damaged areas." "What's the success rate?" Frank asked, the practical rancher in him needing concrete figures rather than theoretical possibilities. James nodded appreciatively at the straightforward question. "In patients with similar presentations to Sarah's, we've seen significant symptom reduction in approximately 68% of cases, with another 22% experiencing moderate improvement. About 10% show minimal or no response." "And side effects?" Sarah inquired, her nurse's training evident. "Primarily temporary immune suppression requiring careful monitoring, fatigue during the stimulation phases, and occasional headaches," James listed. "We haven't observed any permanent adverse effects in the 3 years since trials began." Frank absorbed this information, mentally calculating the odds. Nearly 7 in 10 patients experienced significant improvement. Better prospects than any previous treatment they'd investigated. "What would the timeline look like?" he asked. "The initial treatment phase requires 6 weeks of residence near the hospital," James explained. 3 treatments per week, with monitoring between sessions. After that, depending on response, we typically transition to a maintenance phase with decreasing frequency of visits, potentially manageable through telehealth and coordination with your local physicians in Montana. 6 weeks away from Willow Creek Ranch during the summer season would have been unthinkable just a week ago. Now, measured against the possibility of improving Sarah's quality of life, it seemed a small price to pay. "When could we start?" Sarah asked, the eagerness in her voice unmistakable. James smiled. "I've already placed you on the schedule to begin next Monday, assuming you decide to proceed. That gives you a few days to settle in and prepare." The conversation continued for another hour, covering logistics, expectations, and contingency plans. Throughout, Frank was struck by James's approach, never pressuring, always ensuring they had complete information, treating them as partners in Sarah's care rather than passive recipients of his expertise. As they prepared to leave, James mentioned, casually, "By the way, Emma has been asking when she might see you both. She's quite determined to thank you in person, Frank. Perhaps dinner at our home this weekend. Nothing formal, just a chance for her to express her gratitude properly." The invitation caught Frank off guard. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "We'd be honored," Frank replied, finding to his surprise that he meant it sincerely. As they left the hospital, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the historic buildings surrounding the medical complex, Sarah linked her arm through Frank's. "Well?" she prompted, searching his face. "What do you think?" Frank considered the question carefully. The treatment offered no guarantees, but it represented the first real hope they'd encountered since Sarah's symptoms had begun. The financial aspects had been addressed through James's generous arrangement with the bank. Melissa and Daniel had the ranch well in hand during their absence. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes the current takes you places you never expected to go, and sometimes those places turn out to be exactly where you need to be." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder as they walked, her steps slightly steadier than they had been that morning, though whether from physical improvement or renewed hope, Frank couldn't tell. "That's remarkably philosophical for a man who usually communicates in monosyllables," she teased gently. Frank smiled, feeling a lightness that had been absent for far too long. "Maybe Boston is having an effect on me already. Or maybe," Sarah suggested, "it's what happened at Silver Creek, saving Emma. It changed something in you, Frank, opened something that had been closed for a long time." Frank considered this possibility as they continued toward their hotel. There was truth in Sarah's observation. The act of reaching into those floodwaters had required him to let go not only of physical security, but of the rigid self-sufficiency that had defined his approach to every challenge. Having taken that risk for Emma, perhaps, it had become easier to take other risks, to accept help, to pursue experimental treatment, to imagine a future different from the one he'd resigned himself to. "You might be right," he acknowledged. "Though I suspect you and Melissa have been trying to open that door for years." Sarah laughed softly. "Sometimes the right key comes from an unexpected place." That evening, as they dined in a small restaurant near their hotel, Frank received a text message from Melissa containing photos of Willow Creek Ranch. The images showed significant progress in the flood cleanup, with several areas of the damaged fields already prepared for potential replanting. The final image stopped Frank mid-bite. Melissa stood beside the irrigation system he'd been repairing when Emma's rescue had upended their lives. But the equipment was now clearly functional, water flowing properly through the repaired sections. Beneath the photo, Melissa had written, "Professor Agrawal's design modifications implemented successfully, 40% increased efficiency with 25% less water usage. Sustainable Agriculture Program wants to use our recovery as a case study. Disaster, becoming opportunity. Love you both." Frank passed the phone to Sarah, whose expression brightened as she read the message. "She's thriving with this responsibility," Sarah observed. Maybe the flood was her Silver Creek moment, her chance to step into her capabilities fully. The parallels were striking, disaster creating unexpected paths toward growth for both father and daughter. Frank had always viewed adversity as something to be endured through sheer determination. Now, he was beginning to see it differently, as a force that could reshape landscapes, both physical and personal, sometimes clearing ground for new possibilities that couldn't have existed otherwise. "I'm proud of her," Frank said, reclaiming his phone and studying the image of his daughter standing confidently beside the repaired irrigation system, her expression reflecting the same determination that had characterized 3 generations of Mitchells before her. "She gets that from you," Sarah replied softly. "The ability to see beyond disaster to what might be built from the ruins." Frank shook his head slightly. "I think that particular quality might come more from her mother. I was ready to surrender to foreclosure, remember. You were the one who never stopped believing there was a path forward." Sarah's hand found his across the table, her fingers still graceful despite the occasional tremor that marked her condition. "We balance each other that way, I suppose, always have." As the Boston evening settled around them, the city lights reflecting on the Charles River visible through the restaurant's windows, Frank Mitchell found himself inhabiting a world utterly different from the one he'd known a week earlier. The ranch, the flood, the bank's deadline, these realities remained, but they no longer defined the boundaries of possibility. Somewhere in this unfamiliar urban landscape, a young girl named Emma was perhaps telling friends about her adventure in Montana and the farmer who had pulled her from floodwaters. Her father was preparing a treatment that might change Sarah's prognosis from decline to recovery. And at Willow Creek Ranch, their daughter was transforming disaster into innovation. None of this would have happened if Frank had chosen differently. That day at Silver Creek, if he had prioritized the berms or his own safety over a child's desperate cry for help. That single decision, made without calculation or expectation of return, had altered the course of multiple lives, including his own. Sarah was watching him, reading his expression with the insight born of decades of partnership. "You're thinking about how much has changed," she said. It wasn't a question. Frank nodded. "A week ago, I thought I knew exactly what the future held. Now." He gestured to encompass their surroundings, the hospital, the treatment, all of it. "Now everything's different." "Not everything," Sarah corrected gently. "Some things don't change, Frank. The things that matter most." Frank's hand tightened around hers, understanding exactly what she meant. The landmarks of his life, his love for Sarah and Melissa, his connection to the land, the values that had guided his decisions remained constant even as circumstances shifted dramatically around them. "You're right," he acknowledged. "The current changes course, but the river remains the river." Sarah smiled at his uncharacteristic metaphor. "Exactly, and wherever this particular current takes us, we're in it together." As they finished their meal and prepared to return to their hotel, Frank found himself looking forward to the coming days with an emotion he hadn't experienced in far too long. Genuine hope, not just for Sarah's treatment, but for all the unexpected possibilities that had emerged from the floodwaters of Silver Creek. The elegant brownstone in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the rustic farmhouse Frank had called home for his entire life. 3 stories of impeccably maintained red brick with gleaming black shutters reflected generations of careful stewardship, not unlike Frank's own dedication to Willow Creek Ranch, different expressions of the same fundamental respect for legacy and place. "It's been in Claire's family for nearly 100 years, James explained as he welcomed Frank and Sarah on Saturday evening, referring to his wife. "We're just the current caretakers." Frank nodded, understanding this perspective more deeply than most might. "That's how we feel about our land," he replied, "just passing through, trying to leave it better than we found it." Claire Harrington appeared in the entryway behind her husband, elegant in simple attire that nonetheless conveyed refinement. With warm green eyes that immediately put Frank at ease, she stepped forward to greet them. "Sarah, Frank, welcome unto our home," she said, embracing Sarah with genuine warmth before taking Frank's hand in both of hers. "I've been looking forward to meeting you both properly. The hospital hallways hardly seemed the right setting for expressing what your actions meant to our family." Before Frank could respond with his usual deflection of gratitude, a small figure darted past Claire, launching herself at Frank with the unrestrained enthusiasm that only children can muster. "Mr. Frank!" Emma exclaimed, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You came!" Frank glanced at James and Claire, momentarily startled by this effusive greeting, but their smiling faces reflected only approval and perhaps a touch of amused embarrassment at their daughter's lack of restraint. "Emma," Claire admonished gently, "we talked about giving our guests a moment to settle in before tackling them." Emma stepped back, though her beaming face showed no real contrition. "Sorry," she offered perfunctorily, before continuing with undiminished excitement. "But I needed to thank him properly, and I made something for you and Mrs. Sarah." Frank couldn't help but smile at Emma's enthusiasm, so different from the terrified child he'd pulled from Silver Creek's churning waters. "It's good to see you. Looking so well, Emma. No more nightmares about the water," she announced proudly. "Dad says that's because I know how the story ended, with you saving me." The simple wisdom in her statement struck Frank deeply. How many of life's anxieties persisted because we couldn't see beyond our current chapter to the resolution that might lie ahead. Claire smoothly guided them through to a comfortably appointed living room where the formal architecture of the historic home gave way to a space clearly designed for family connection rather than impression. Books filled built-in shelves, a piano stood in one corner, and photographs of family adventures adorned the walls. It reminded Frank unexpectedly of his own living room at Willow Creek Ranch. Different in style but identical in purpose. A sanctuary for the people who mattered most. As they settled into comfortable seating, Emma disappeared momentarily before returning with a carefully wrapped package, which she presented to Frank and Sarah with ceremonial gravity. "I made this for you," she explained as Frank accepted the gift, "to say thank you for saving me and to help Mrs. Sarah feel better." Frank glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragement before carefully unwrapping the package. Inside was a hand-crafted scrapbook, its cover decorated with pressed wildflowers and the carefully lettered title, Heroes and Healing. Opening to the first page, Frank found a surprisingly sophisticated child's drawing of the rescue scene at Silver Creek, himself wading into the churning waters while Emma clung to the fallen tree. Accompanying the image were newspaper clippings about the flood and rescue that Frank hadn't even known existed. "Dad helped me find the articles," Emma explained, "but I did all the artwork myself." As they turned the pages, the scrapbook transitioned from the rescue to images of Massachusetts General Hospital, carefully labeled diagrams of the brain, and colorful illustrations of what Emma imagined the treatment would accomplish for Sarah. "This page shows the special medicine finding all the broken paths and fixing them," Emma explained earnestly, pointing to a whimsical drawing where tiny figures in lab coats repaired a network of tangled pathways. "And here's Mrs. Sarah dancing after she gets better." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she studied the hopeful illustration of herself, arms outstretched in joyful movement, an activity her condition had increasingly restricted over the past 2 years. "It's beautiful, Emma," she managed, touching the page gently. "Thank you for believing I'll dance again." "You will," Emma assured her with absolute conviction. "Dad's the best brain doctor in the world. He promised to use all his super doctor powers to help you." James cleared his throat, a hint of embarrassment coloring his face. "I believe I said I would apply the full extent of my medical expertise and the resources of our research program," he clarified with a smile. "Emma has a flair for dramatic interpretation." "Super Doctor Powers sounds more effective," Sarah replied, with a warmth that transformed her tear-filled eyes into beacons of hope. "I'll take whatever works." The evening unfolded with remarkable ease, the initial awkwardness of their different backgrounds dissolving into genuine connection. Claire proved to be not only a gracious hostess, but a gifted conversationalist who drew out Frank's rarely shared stories of ranch life and his family's history in Montana. "It sounds like your grandfather and my great-grandfather would have had much in common," she observed, after Frank described William Mitchell's determination during the Dust Bowl years. Different challenges, certainly, but the same resilience and commitment to stewardship. Frank nodded, surprised by how comfortable he felt discussing his family history in this setting so far removed from the ranch. "The land teaches you that you're part of something larger than yourself," he reflected. "Something that began before you arrived and continues after you're gone. All you can do is contribute your chapter as best you can." "That's a perspective I wish more people understood," James commented thoughtfully. "In medicine, especially in research, it's tempting to focus on dramatic breakthroughs and personal recognition. But the truly meaningful work happens incrementally, with each researcher building on what came before and laying groundwork for those who will follow." The parallel struck Frank forcefully. The similarity between tending land across generations and advancing medical knowledge through collective effort. Both required patience, humility, and faith in a future one might not personally witness. After dinner, while Claire helped Emma prepare for bed, James invited Frank and Sarah to his study, a warm space lined with medical texts, but personalized with family photographs and mementos from his career. "I wanted to show you something," he explained, retrieving a framed photograph from his desk. "This was taken about 15 years ago during my neurosurgery residency." The image showed a much younger James standing beside an elderly man in a hospital bed. Both were smiling, the older man's hand clasped firmly in James's. "This is Walter Erickson," James continued. "He was a commercial fisherman from Gloucester who pulled me from Boston Harbor when I was 8 years old." He looked directly at Frank, the connection explicit. "I'd fallen from a tour boat during a school field trip. Walter dove in without hesitation, much like you did for Emma." Frank studied the photograph with renewed interest, the parallels unmistakable. "He saved your life." James nodded. "Absolutely. But that's not why I'm showing you this. You see, 20 years after the rescue, Walter developed a rare form of brain cancer. By pure coincidence, or perhaps something more meaningful, he was assigned to the hospital where I was completing my residency." Sarah leaned forward, immediately understanding the significance. "You were able to treat him." "I was part of the surgical team," James confirmed. "Not the lead surgeon, I wasn't experienced enough yet, but I was there, participating in saving the life of the man who had saved mine." He returned the photograph to its place on his desk. "I've always believed there was profound meaning in that full-circle moment." Frank absorbed this story, seeing in it not just the remarkable coincidence, but the deeper pattern James was suggesting, the way actions of compassion created ripples that extended far beyond their original intent, sometimes returning years later in unexpected ways. "I'm not a particularly mystical person," James continued. "Medical training tends to ground you in the tangible and measurable, but I've come to believe that certain connections transcend logical explanation." He smiled slightly. "When Walter's case appeared on my service rotation, one of my colleagues offered to trade assignments, knowing our history might make it emotionally complicated. But I knew immediately that I was meant to be there, that the circle that began when he pulled me from the water was completing itself through my ability to contribute to his care." "Did he recover?" Sarah asked softly. James nodded. 5 more good years. He walked his daughter down the aisle, met 2 grandchildren, and spent many more days on his beloved ocean before the cancer eventually returned. The implications of James's story hung in the air between them. The suggestion that Frank's decision to save Emma might be part of a larger pattern beyond their current understanding, a circle beginning to complete itself through Sarah's treatment. "I'm not saying I believe in simplistic karma or cosmic debts," James clarified, perhaps sensing Frank's thoughts, "but I do believe that compassionate actions create connections that matter, that endure, that sometimes manifest in ways we couldn't predict." Frank thought of Silver Creek, of the moment he'd spotted Emma clinging to that fallen tree. He'd acted without calculation, without any thought of future benefit. Yet that single decision had opened an unexpected door for Sarah, for the ranch, perhaps for all of them. "I understand," Frank said simply. Later that night, as they returned to their hotel, Sarah was uncharacteristically quiet, her expression thoughtful. "You're processing something," Frank observed as they prepared for bed. Sarah nodded, sitting carefully on the edge of the mattress. "James's story about the fisherman. It made me think about all the moments that had to align perfectly for us to be here now. If you hadn't been checking the berms that day, if Emma hadn't slipped into the creek at precisely that time, if James hadn't become a neurologist specializing in exactly my condition." She looked up at Frank, her eyes bright with emotion. It feels like more than coincidence, doesn't it? Frank sat beside her, taking her hand in his. Throughout his life, he had approached challenges with practical determination rather than philosophical reflection. The land needed tending, equipment needed repair, crops needed harvesting. These were concrete realities that responded to direct action, not contemplation. Yet Sarah's observation resonated with something he'd felt but never articulated, the sense that beneath the apparent randomness of life's hardships and blessings ran currents of meaning waiting to be recognized. Maybe that's what faith really is, he suggested after a thoughtful silence, not believing everything happens for a predetermined reason, but trusting that meaning can emerge from whatever happens, if we're open to seeing it. Sarah leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. That sounds suspiciously profound for a man who claims his philosophy is fix what's broken and plant what grows. Frank smiled, acknowledging the gentle teasing. Maybe Boston is expanding my horizons. Or maybe, Sarah countered softly, those horizons were always there, just waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Monday morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that seemed fitting for the beginning of Sarah's treatment. The hospital welcomed them with the now familiar efficiency orchestrated by Rebecca, James's patient coordinator, who guided them through preliminary procedures with compassionate precision. The treatment room itself surprised Frank with its combination of advanced technology and thoughtful human touches. Comfortable seating had been arranged not just for Sarah, but for Frank as well, positioned so he could maintain contact with her. Throughout the procedure, soft music played in the background, and the lighting was adjustable to reduce strain and anxiety. We found that the environmental context significantly impacts treatment efficacy, Dr. Patel explained as she prepared the specialized equipment. Stress hormones can counteract some of the neurological benefits we're trying to achieve, so we've designed the space to minimize anxiety and promote relaxation. As Sarah settled into the treatment chair, Frank took his place beside her, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had sustained them through countless challenges over their decades together. The procedure itself was less dramatic than Frank had anticipated, a precisely calibrated infusion of the experimental immunotherapy compound, followed by non-invasive neural stimulation delivered through a sophisticated headset that Dr. Patel positioned carefully over Sarah's skull. You might experience a slight tingling sensation or see brief flashes of light in your peripheral vision, she warned Sarah. That's completely normal and indicates the stimulation is reaching the targeted neural pathways. Throughout the 3-hour procedure, Frank maintained his steady presence, sometimes speaking softly to Sarah, sometimes simply being there, his weathered hand a constant anchor in hers. He marveled at her courage, her willingness to trust this unfamiliar process that offered no certainties, but held more promise than anything they'd encountered in their long medical journey. When the treatment concluded, Dr. Patel removed the neural stimulation headset and conducted a brief assessment of Sarah's responses. Everything looks excellent for a first session, she concluded with evident satisfaction. How are you feeling, Sarah? Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. Tired, she admitted, but a different kind of tired than usual. Less like exhaustion and more like after intense concentration. Dr. Patel nodded. That's consistent with what many patients report. The neural stimulation requires your brain to form new pathways, which is cognitively demanding work, even though you're not consciously directing it. Will we know if it's working? Frank asked, the practical rancher in him still seeking measurable outcomes. We'll conduct formal assessments after the 3rd and 6th treatments, Dr. Patel explained, but many patients report subtle improvements in coordination and reduced tremor as early as the second week. The key is to remember that neural regeneration is a gradual process, more like rehabilitating land after a drought than fixing a broken fence. The agricultural metaphor, likely chosen specifically for Frank's benefit, helped him conceptualize the treatment process in familiar terms. Restoring damaged soil required patience, consistent care, and faith that natural processes would respond to thoughtful intervention, not unlike the approach they were taking with Sarah's neural pathways. As they left the hospital that afternoon, Frank was struck by Sarah's quiet determination. Despite the fatigue Dr. Patel had warned would follow the treatment, she insisted on walking the short distance to Boston Common rather than returning immediately to the hotel. "I want to feel the sun," she explained simply, "and see something growing." The public garden offered a welcome contrast to the clinical environment they'd just left. Flowering trees, carefully tended beds of early summer blooms, and expanses of green lawn where people relaxed and children played. They found a bench near a particularly vibrant display of flowers, Sarah's botanical knowledge allowing her to identify varieties that Frank, for all his agricultural expertise, had never encountered. "It's strange," she observed as they watched, a young family picnicking nearby. "For 2 years, I've been defining myself increasingly by what I was losing. Mobility, independence, the ability to paint, to garden, to be fully present for you and Melissa." She turned to Frank, something new in her expression. "But since we've been here, since the treatment started, I've been thinking more about what might be regained, what might still be possible." Frank understood this shift intimately. He had experienced a similar transformation in his thinking about the ranch, from focusing on what the flood had destroyed to recognizing what Melissa might build from the aftermath. "Hope is a powerful thing," he acknowledged. "Maybe the most powerful force there is. Not hope alone," Sarah corrected gently. "Hope connected to action, to trying something new even when it's frightening or uncertain." She squeezed his hand, like wading into floodwaters to save a child, or accepting help when pride would have you refuse it. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to their lives. Treatment days at the hospital alternating with recovery. Days when they explored Boston's historic sites or simply rested in their hotel. James and Claire became not just doctor and supporters, but genuine friends, including them in family dinners and introducing them to their favorite local restaurants and hidden corners of the city. Frank found himself unexpectedly drawn to Boston's maritime history, spending hours at the harbor watching modern vessels navigate the same waters that had welcomed ships for centuries. Something about the continuity across generations reminded him of Willow Creek Ranch, different hands guiding the work, but the essential purpose remaining constant. Daily video calls with Melissa revealed remarkable progress at the ranch. The irrigation modifications she had implemented were showing promising results, and several agricultural technology companies had expressed interest in documenting the recovery process as a case study in climate resilience. "Professor Agrawal thinks we could qualify for a sustainability grant," Melissa explained during one evening call, her enthusiasm evident even through the small screen of Frank's phone. The flood actually created an opportunity to implement systems we probably wouldn't have considered otherwise. Frank felt a surge of pride in his daughter's capabilities and her vision for the ranch's future. What he had viewed as potentially catastrophic, his absence during a critical recovery period, had instead created space for Melissa to apply her education and perspective in ways that might ultimately strengthen Willow Creek Ranch's long-term viability. By the 4th week of treatment, the improvements in Sarah's condition had become unmistakable. The tremor in her hands had diminished significantly, her gait was steadier, and the debilitating headaches that had punctuated her weeks had decreased in both frequency and intensity. The quantitative assessments confirm what we're observing clinically, Dr. Patel reported during their progress evaluation. The neural pathways are showing remarkable regeneration, particularly in the cerebellar regions controlling fine motor coordination. James, who had joined the evaluation session, nodded in agreement. Sarah, your response rate places you in the top percentile of our trial participants. If this trajectory continues, we anticipate substantial recovery of function, potentially 70–80% of pre-disease capacity. The statistical estimate, delivered in James's measured professional tone, struck Frank and Sarah with the force of a revelation. After 2 years of steady decline and diminishing hope, the possibility of recovering most of what had been lost seemed almost miraculous. "What does this mean for the long term?" Frank asked, working to keep his voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "After we return to Montana, we'll transition to a maintenance protocol," James explained. "Monthly neural stimulation sessions that your local neurologist can administer with equipment will provide, supported by quarterly video consultations with our team here. The immunotherapy component requires less frequent administration once the initial response is established, perhaps every 3 months for the first year, then annually after that." The logistical details washed over Frank, important but secondary to the fundamental reality. Sarah would get better, not completely perhaps, but substantially, enough to paint again, to garden, to move through her days without the constant shadow of progressive disability hanging over every activity. That evening, alone in their hotel room, the full impact of the day's news finally registered. Sarah stood before the room's full-length mirror, deliberately raising her arms above her head in a motion that had become increasingly difficult over the past year, and watching with wonder as they moved smoothly, with only the slightest tremor at maximum extension. "Frank," she whispered, turning to him with tears streaming down her face. "It's working. It's really working." Frank crossed the room in 3 strides, gathering her into his arms with a tenderness that belied his strength. They stood together, weeping without shame or restraint, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of hope fulfilled, of darkness receding before unexpected light. "Emma was right," Sarah said when they finally separated, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I might dance again after all." As if to prove the point, she reached for Frank's hands, guiding them to her waist before placing her own on his shoulders. There in their Boston hotel room, with no music, but the distant city sounds filtering through the windows, they swayed together in a simple dance they hadn't shared since Sarah's symptoms had made such movement too difficult. The moment contained no medical measurements or statistical significance, yet it represented the most profound evidence of healing either of them had experienced. Not just physical restoration, but the reclamation of joy that had gradually diminished alongside Sarah's mobility. As their final week of treatment approached, Frank received an unexpected call from Tucker Reynolds at Alpine Bank, back in Riverdale. "Frank, I've been reviewing the situation with Willow Creek Ranch," the banker began, his tone uncharacteristically positive. "The 6-month extension Dr. Harrington arranged has given us time to reassess the property's long-term viability." Frank tensed slightly, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "And what have you concluded?" "Well, that's just it," Tucker continued. "Your daughter's innovations with the irrigation system and soil remediation techniques have caught significant attention. The university's Sustainable Agriculture program submitted a formal assessment indicating that the flood recovery methods being implemented represent a potential model for climate resilience in agricultural operations throughout the region." Frank listened with growing amazement as Tucker explained that the bank was now prepared to offer a comprehensive refinancing package with significantly improved terms, not as a favor or charitable concession, but because Willow Creek Ranch's demonstrable innovation had enhanced its value as a long-term investment. The board was particularly impressed by the water usage reduction metrics, Tucker concluded. In a region increasingly affected by drought conditions, the techniques your daughter is implementing represent exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we want to support. After ending the call, Frank sat motionless, absorbing this latest unexpected development. The very disaster that had threatened to end 3 generations of Mitchell stewardship had instead catalyzed innovations that might sustain the ranch for generations to come. When he shared the news with Sarah, her response captured perfectly the journey they had traveled since that fateful day at Silver Creek. "It seems," she observed with quiet wonder, "that when you jumped into those floodwaters to save Emma, you were actually saving all of us, though none of us could have known it at the time." Frank nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. His instinctive act of compassion, reaching out to someone in desperate need without calculation of personal cost, had initiated a cascade of connections and possibilities that no one could have anticipated. As he looked at Sarah, her movements, now fluid where they had once been halting, her expression alive with renewed hope where resignation had begun to settle, Frank Mitchell recognized that sometimes the most transformative journeys begin with a single step, taken not for oneself, but for another. The floodwaters that had threatened his livelihood had also carried within them the seeds of unexpected renewal. For the land he loved, for the wife he cherished, and for his own understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. Not self-sufficient. Isolation, but the courage to both give and receive help when circumstances demanded it. The current had indeed carried them to places they never expected to go. And as Sarah had suggested weeks earlier, those places had proven to be exactly where they needed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.